I had the opportunity to take an early look at a new Sword and Sorcery magazine. This magazine is Battleborn. It has a strong identity and a clear focus on classic sword and sorcery, while also leaving room for newer authors to pave the road to the future. There are classic stories that have been reprinted for the first time in decades. There are tales from established professionals and tales from newer authors who are up and coming. Hi everyone, I'm James, an author, editor, and the owner of The Arcanist, an independent publisher dedicated to sharing excellent fantasy fiction. Now there's a lot I really like about Battleborn Magazine. I love their focus on classic sword and sorcery and putting these older stories in front of new readers for the first time. I also appreciate their passion for uplifting newer authors and putting them in front of a very loyal readership that has been around for a long time. Overall, the fiction was strong, and there was only a handful of stories that I put down because they weren't to my taste. Among the fiction, there are a bunch of different types of settings, a bunch of different types of characters. It was like we got a tour around the world. There's a very clearly defined personality to the magazine that makes it ideal for a specific kind of reader, but the specificity pulls it all together in a very cohesive package that I think anyone could enjoy. This isn't just a fiction magazine either. There are non-fiction columns that are covering a range of different topics that are all aimed at celebrating the craft of sword and sorcery fiction. From analyses of the stories within the magazines, to book recommendations, to an in-depth analysis to the first line of the story, this is what helps push it beyond the scope of your average literary magazine. Usually, I feel like a lot of newer lit mags are almost indistinguishable from anthologies. The only difference is what the editors choose to call it. Battleborn truly is a magazine pulled right out of the 20th century. Lee Patton, a friend of mine and one of the authors featured in this issue, told me that he feels like the magazine is trying to harness more of a feeling of like the Savage Sword of Conan, a sort of multimedia experience, where the Savage Sword was obviously focused only on Conan and primarily was focused on comics while also including fiction and some articles. Battleborn is focused on the fiction and on the genre as a whole, bringing in other types of media and even a little comic strip that are all aimed at celebrating the genre of sword and sorcery. All of the fiction was very strong. Some of my favorites, which is almost the entire list of fiction, were Blood of the Oni by C.L. Werner, Pearls of the Vampire Queen by Michael Shea, which had been out of print for many years, I think over 20, A Stone's Throw by Howard Andrew Jones, an unreleased story of Hanuvar, which is actually my first exposure to one of Howard Andrew Jones's story and the reason I'm picking up the Hanuvar trilogy, To Boast of Victory by Eric Wagg. I'm also a reason why I picked up Eric Wagg's first book, Temple of the River King by Lee Patton, which might be the reason you pick up his first book, A Valley of Shadow, if you loved Rock the Deathless and were charmed by his cold dead hands. There's plenty more of that here in A Valley of Shadow. I recommend you check that out. The Fury's Blade by Robert Rhodes had this very Zorro-esque feeling to it, something that took me right back to my childhood staring at an old CRT running the overused VHS tape that probably was overdue at Blockbuster. Vengeance Vow by TJ Marquise, another newcomer, was also a very strong inclusion, genuinely some of the most fun I had with the fiction in this issue. Another element I want to touch on with Battleborn is its contribution to the culture of sword and sorcery. Now, I'm pretty new to the genre as it stands today. I was familiar with the Appendix N because of my love for D&D when I was a kid, but I've really only started approaching sword and sorcery in the last year or two, and only seriously since the beginning of 26 when I started covering it on YouTube. There's a lot that I didn't know about the people behind, modern sword and sorcery. One of those people was Howard Andrew Jones, who sadly passed away last year in 2025. Howard Andrew Jones was the author of the Hanuvar Chronicles and also the editor behind Tales of the Magician's Skull, which was one of the most beloved sword and sorcery magazines of our century. Sean C.W. Korsgaard, the editor of Battleborn, spends a lot of time making sure that the reader knows who Howard Andrew Jones is. I think this was a wonderful touch. It added this personal element to it, but also honored the memory of a professional that had advocated for so many people in this third wave of sword and sorcery that we see today. I think this was a wonderful choice and a very tasteful one. It's important for new readers coming in to know who the champions of sword and sorcery were. A Stone's Throw was my first exposure to Jones's writing. I'm definitely going to dive into the Hand of Our Chronicles. I already have it loaded up on my Kindle, so that was a treat. Another notable inclusion was Pearls of the Vampire Queen by Michael Shea. Now, I've never read Michael Shea before, and it might be because apparently you can't get his books anywhere unless you're willing to spend a ridiculous amount of money on eBay for used copies. But Pearls of the Vampire Queen was a story that has been out of print for over 20 years, and now it's here in the pages. This is a really strong goal of Battleborn, to bring these older stories that are inaccessible to new readers. Now, there are a few weaknesses to Battleborn that I think are worth talking about. I believe that both of my gripes are temporary and might not be your experience when you pick up the full version of the issue. The version that I read was an early reader's copy. It wasn't fully populated with art, and it contained a few typographical errors. The layout and the typesetting was inconsistent. At first, the issue began with a very readable typeface, something that I felt harnessed that classic feeling that they're going through without being Times New Roman, but also remaining very readable. There was a second font choice that started appearing in other entries in the magazine. The text was thinner and more stylized. It looked like something that might appear on a magazine advertisement rather than the body text of a book. Overall, I found that second font to be extremely hard to read and distracting. Now, if these changes were only between stories, I think I could get over that. That's a very common thing with older magazines. They will change the style per story. But there were occurrences where the typesetting changed, like mid-paragraph. So we go from our very readable classic font to this very thin, stylized font within the same paragraph. That's just a mistake. It shouldn't be there. It's going to harm readability. It's going to cause distraction from the story. There were very few stories that I ended up not finishing. I didn't read with like a completionist attitude. I approached this issue as I would if I were just a reader who had bought the issue. And there was one of the stories that I felt was very strong, but I ended up getting so removed from it because of the font choice in the body that I ended up moving on because I wanted to read something I didn't have to strain so hard just to look at. Even if the multiple fonts stay within the issue, I do hope that they find all of these places where the font changes, because that is, like I said, extremely distracting and it can ruin the reading experience. Now, the other point of friction that I have is actually the subscription model. It's not entirely clear how new writers are supposed to get their hands on Battleborn. Just this morning, I did notice that there is an Amazon listing for the Kindle version. I'm assuming a paperback will be attached to that too after the release date. But beyond that, there's only two places you can find Battleborn Magazine: their Facebook page and their Indiegogo campaign. Now, they funded on Indiegogo with over $11,000 last year, and that's awesome. It shows that there's a lot of people who believe in this project. But there's no easy place to get an answer on how you're supposed to subscribe to a year or a season of Battleborn Magazine. Now, after about 5 times of looking at their Indiegogo campaign, I realized that I could still back. Even though the campaign was over, they still have tiers available for you to back at. It's like a persistent campaign rather than a totally limited one. That's a fine way of doing things, and I was able to put in my order for the first 3 issues. Still not entirely sure that that's the right intended way to subscribe to Battleborn. What I would like to see in the future would be a landing page with very clear calls to action on where I'm supposed to go, perhaps even direct sales on a web store. I know that that is something that is not totally accessible. It would be labor from a programmer. It would be some time and effort, but I think it would be worthwhile. You know, this is a upscale magazine from my view. It is a luxury item, something that's trying to do more than just share information. It's trying to provide an experience, So you need to make it accessible for the reader, make it as easy as possible to acquire it. The only reason I put so much effort into getting my copies was because I really care about this for unique reasons. But a random person just learning about it off the cuff isn't going to have that same motivation. There's a lot of friction to actually acquiring these issues. But all that culminates in kind of an obscure feeling for the reader. If you didn't back the campaign last year and you came into it as a new reader like I did, you're left scratching your head, not really understanding how you're supposed to get involved. Which is a shame, because this is something that I want to support. It's something I want to encourage other people to support. Hopefully those two things get addressed as the first issue sees its first full release. Overall, the content and editorial direction is extremely strong, and it was a fun read. It not only teaches you about the sword and sorcery genre as a whole, but it gives you some damn good stories to check out along the way. And we had Lee Patton, the Arcanist Zone managing editor, feature in there for the first time. It was pretty cool to see Isrok the Deathless out in the wild. I genuinely love those stories, and every time I get to have a new one, I'm like a kid on Christmas. Overall, I'm coming away with a positive impression, and I did go ahead and subscribe to the first 3 issues. Battleborn is very much worth your time and attention, and I'm really excited to see where it goes in the near future. If you like what I do, please like and subscribe to the video. Check out Battleborn. If you liked Temple of the River King, check out A Valley of Shadow for more Isrok the Deathless. And until next time, have a wonderful day, keep reading, and keep reading Sword and Sorcery.